All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and talk about our coordinate plane system. So, here we go. First of all, we got our two axes. This is my x-axis. My x-axis runs like this. My y-axis, here's my y's. All right, now, this is how this works. I've got an origin right here. That's going to be my origin. Now, from the origin is basically my zero. So it's basically my starting point, okay? So everything on this side in respect to x is going to be a positive x. This is my negative x. I have a positive x up here, and I have a negative, or excuse me, positive y up here. I got a negative y down here. Now this is particularly important. Yes, it's important for you to understand your algebra, but this is going to play a big deal in your trig later on when you start talking about your functions. All right, so the idea of this is that I have, in this quadrant, I'm in quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, so what do I know? I know in this quadrant right here, I'm going to have my x's are going to be positive, and my y's are going to be positive, just like that. All right? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and I notice I got a negative x here, right? So at this point here, my x's are going to be negative, and my y's are going to be positive, and this should be a little over here. So positive y. Negative x, negative y, and we know we're going positive x, negative y. All right, so everything's positive up here, everything's negative up here. Negative x's, negative y's, okay? All right, now, as we're looking at this, as this becomes, from 0, this becomes more positive. From 0, this becomes more negative, more positive on the y, more negative on, more negative on the y here, okay? Now, the way that we write, you'll notice I put my x and then my y. Remember, if you do the alphabets, x comes before y. In our coordinate system here, x comes before y, okay? So with that said, if I have, this is my x-axis. So what I want you to recognize is that my x is being counted, but my y's are still at 0 all along this. And later on we're going to talk about our intercepts, where when something crosses the axis here, if it crosses the x-axis, we're going to call it an x-intercept. If it crosses the y-axis, it's going to be called a y-intercept. We'll get to that a little later, but it's coming. So at this point here, if I've got, my origin is 0, 0. So at this point, I've got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this point right here is going to be 5 in reference to my x's, but you'll notice in my y's, at the 0, it doesn't go up or down, so I'm at 0. So there's my 5, 0. In this case here, here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, right there. In this case, notice my x doesn't change from the origin, so I've got a 0 and a negative 3, just like that. All right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. At this case right here, my x is a negative 2, and my y is a positive 2. And these are what we're expecting. Remember, negative x, positive y. At this point in here, 1, 2, 3, and let me go ahead and get rid of these quadrant signs. I should have done that before for all of them. Okay, so at this point here, I've got my x is negative 1, and my y is -1 as well. Right there. Whereas in this spot, 1, 2, 3, 4, my x is -1 and my y is -4. Now this is going to come up later when we start talking about a graph being undefined, and we'll touch on that, when it comes up. But for now, what I really want you to understand is that as we're charting something out, if you get a point, you go through. If I have to identify this point, I say, well, hold on. In the x, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and it lines up. There's 4. And in the y, I've got 1, 2, 3. There's y is 3, and that is my point 4, 3. Okay? So again, we talked about quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. We talked about our x-axis. We talked about our y-axis. We said that x is going to come first. X, Y, X, Y. We know that everything's positive in our quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, our x is negative, y is positive. They're both negative in quadrant 3. And over here in quadrant 4, we have a positive x and negative y. And we talked about how we were going to go ahead and line them up. It's just like a map. I mean, well, before you guys were born or whatever, before Google and all that stuff for your maps, basically what we had what we grew up with was maps. So instead of your say your Garmin's and everything else and the Google directions, basically you'd have a bunch of streets, you'd have some streets, and let's say this is Henderson, and what they would do is they would mark all this off on a grid. They say, okay, well here's A, B, C, D, E, and then 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you were looking at for Henderson and let's say Wilson Street, where they intersected, someone would say, oh, well that's, whatchamacallit, that's C3 or whatever, So they say, oh, well here's the C, there's the 3, upsy, downsy, leftsy, rightsy, just like that. So with that said, same concept, except in our case, instead of using letters and numbers, our map is basically a grid right here. We know we were going X first, Y, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 2, 3, just like that. All right? Okay, enjoy.